Hello everyone, and welcome back. Today's story feels a little different, softer, brighter, like the quiet heartbeat of hope beneath winter's cold breath. Outside, the fields still sleep under frost. But in the little wooden house by the river, something new is stirring. Laughter, warmth, and the first green shoots pushing through the soil. Sometimes it's not the end that changes us. It's the courage to begin again. So, what does it look like when two people scarred by the past choose to plant something new? Not just in the ground, but in their hearts. Let's find out. Morning sunlight spilled gently over the fields, brushing the garden with a pale gold hue. The air was cold, sharp enough to sting the skin, yet filled with the faint smell of wet earth, the scent of beginnings. Huyen bent down near the garden beds, her breath visible in the crisp air, hands covered in soil. Every movement was careful, patient. Day stood nearby, stacking planks of wood he had just carried from the shed. His sleeves were rolled up, his fingers rough, but there was a quiet steadiness in the way he worked, the kind of calm that comes after a storm. "You're planting onions?" he asked, his voice soft, almost blending into the wind. Huyen nodded. "For Tet. People use them when they make sticky rice cakes. If we're lucky, we'll sell them at the market." Dee smiled faintly, always thinking ahead. She looked up at him, sunlight catching her hair. "You have to, or winter will swallow you whole." Her words hung in the air, part truth, part philosophy. He understood. Life had been harsh to both of them, but somehow, here in this small patch of soil, it felt forgiving again. The garden was a mess of greens and browns, of new life pushing up through the cold. Dill, beans, taro, little specks of color against the pale earth. Beside the garden, Maya played with Bibi the cat, laughing as the animal chased dry leaves down the path. Day watched them for a moment, a faint smile forming on his lips. "She's happy," he said. Huyen turned, following his gaze. "She's a child," she replied. "Children always find a way to smile, even when the world forgets how." He looked at her, a little longer than he meant to. Maybe adults can learn from that. Huyen didn't answer, just continued pressing small bulbs into the soil, her movements rhythmic and certain. "You start with something tiny," she said softly, "and if you care for it every day, it grows. Maybe that's true for people too." Dee crouched beside her, helping to cover the bulbs with soil. "Then we'll take care of this garden," he said, "and see what grows." They worked together quietly, the sound of their hands moving through the soil, the creak of wooden boards, the faint hum of the river nearby. All of it blended into a kind of music. It wasn't loud or grand, but it was steady, alive. When they finished, Huyen leaned back on her heels and looked around. "It's strange," she said. "No matter how many times the plants die, I never stop planting again." Day nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "That's what makes you strong." She smiled. "Maybe. Or maybe it just means I'm stubborn." The two laughed quietly, their voices mingling with the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. It felt easy, natural, a language they didn't need to translate. Later, Day brought out the wood he had been cutting. "I'll finish the fence by the river," he said. "It'll keep Maya safe when she plays out here." "I'll help," Huyen offered, but he shook his head. "You've done enough. Rest a bit." She stayed near the garden, watching him work. His movements were precise, deliberate. Each nail, each plank, was another mark of care. A man building not just walls, but something like belonging. And as the wind swept through the fields, carrying the faint scent of smoke from the house, Huyen felt something stir quietly inside her. Hope. Not loud or certain, but steady, like the roots growing beneath the soil, unseen, but alive. Winter, she thought, would not last forever, because even in the coldest season, there are hands still planting, hearts still waiting, and lives quietly beginning again. By afternoon, the air grew softer, tinted with the faint smell of wood smoke and rain-soaked soil. Day and Huyen worked side by side, the rhythm of their day moving in quiet harmony. A hammer's echo here, the rustle of leaves there, the sound of living, simple and unhurried. "Hold this board steady," Day said as he aligned it against the new fence. Huyen pressed her hands against the rough wood, her fingers brushing his for a brief second. Neither spoke, but both felt it, that fleeting current of warmth that neither dared to name. Once the fence stood firm, Huyen brushed the dirt from her palms and glanced toward the garden. "I dug up a flower from the forest this morning," she said. It looked lonely. Dee raised an eyebrow. "A flower?" She nodded. "A peony, I think. It blooms even in the cold. I thought it might like it here." He smiled faintly. "Then let's find it a home." They walked toward the small patch of land beside the house, the one where sunlight always lingered longest before dusk. Huyen carried the small plant carefully, roots wrapped in damp soil. Dee dug the hole, his movements gentle, deliberate. "Here," he asked. She studied the spot for a moment, then nodded. "Between these two rows, it'll look balanced." Day placed the flower into the earth, and Huyen knelt beside him, pressing the soil down with her bare hands. For a moment, they stayed like that, two figures in the fading light, quiet, connected, surrounded by the scent of new earth. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "It will be," Day replied. "Give it time." He looked at her then, really looked. Her hair was messy from the wind, her face touched by dirt, but her eyes glowed with something bright and unbroken. It struck him how much strength could hide in gentleness. "You're teasing me with that look," she said, laughing lightly. "Maybe," he admitted. "But I mean it. You're beautiful, more than you know." She shook her head, pretending not to hear. "Go fetch some water before you say something you'll regret." He laughed, picking up the bucket. "You'll thank me later, when that flower blooms twice as bright." As he walked toward the river, the sun began to dip, turning the sky into streaks of orange and silver. Huyen watched him go, the sound of his footsteps fading into the hush of the evening. Around her, the garden glimmered with life, small sprouts peeking through the soil, the new fence standing proud, and the single peony swaying gently in the breeze. When day returned, they watered the flower together. The soil darkened, the scent of rain rising with it. "Now," Huyen whispered, "it has a chance to grow." Day looked at the flower, then at her. "So do we." The words slipped out before he could stop them. For a moment, the world went still. Only the soft murmur of the river and the beating of two hearts beneath the same winter sky. Huyen didn't reply. She simply smiled, the kind of smile that said, "I heard you." The evening carried on quietly. They sat by the doorway, watching the mist drift over the garden, the light dimming into blue. Maya slept inside, her dreams safe beneath the newly finished walls. "It's strange," Huyen murmured, "how the smallest things, a fence, a flower, a meal, can make a place feel alive again." Day nodded. "Maybe that's all home ever is, the small things done with care." The first star appeared, faint but steady, above the hills. And as the night deepened, The two of them stayed there, not talking, not planning, just existing within a moment that felt enough. Because sometimes healing doesn't come from leaving. It comes from planting something new and watching it live. The following days unfolded quietly, one after another. A slow rhythm of work, laughter, and the gentle hum of life finding its way back. The wooden house, once bare and cold, now pulsed with warmth. Outside, the garden had begun to change. Tiny green shoots broke through the soil, trembling in the wind yet full of life. Dee stood by the fence one morning, watching sunlight glimmer off the dew. Behind him, he heard the familiar clatter of bowls and Huyen's voice calling softly, "Breakfast's ready." He turned, smiling. "Sweet potatoes again?" She laughed. "And taro soup, winter food." Inside, the smell of roasted corn and firewood filled the air. Maya sat by the stove, humming to herself, feeding small pieces of wood into the flames. Bibi, the gray cat, slept curled beside her feet, twitching its tail in dreams. As they ate, Day glanced around the house, the walls they had built, the soft light spilling through the new window, the faint curtain Huyen had hung just yesterday. Everything about the place whispered home. After breakfast, Huyen began her chores in the garden, while Day prepared to rebuild the old stove. "It's too low," he said. "You always have to bend." "I told you not to worry about it," she replied. But he was already measuring the bricks. The sound of tools filled the air, a steady beat beneath the chirping of birds. Every now and then, Huyen looked up from her work to see him focused, determined, his shirt damp with sweat despite the chill. There was something quietly noble in the way he worked. A man building not just a stove, but a life that finally made sense again. By midday, the new stove stood taller, solid, and bright red against the wooden wall. Huyen clapped her hands in approval. "It's perfect," she said. Dee grinned, brushing off the dust. "Told you it'd be done before lunch." Later, they sat near the fire, roasting corn, their hands close enough for the warmth to pass between them. Smoke curled through the air, carrying the scent of earth, wood, and home. "Do you ever think about the future?" Huyen asked quietly. "Sometimes," Day replied, "but not too far ahead. I've learned the future grows best when you water the present." She smiled at that. "Then I guess we're watering it well." He looked at her, eyes soft. "Maybe we are." A comfortable silence followed. The fire popped. Outside, a breeze swept through the trees, rustling the fence, making the peony sway in rhythm. The tiny flower, once frail and uncertain, now stood taller, its petals trembling but unbroken. Dee noticed it first. "Look," he said. "It's blooming." Huyen turned, her face lighting up. "Already?" He nodded, watching her expression more than the flower itself. "You were right. Even in winter, some things still find the strength to grow." She looked at him then, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe we did too." The light outside shifted to gold, painting their faces in warmth. For the first time in a long while, Day didn't feel the weight of what he'd lost, only the quiet joy of what he'd found. Something simple, something real. That evening, as they shared the last ear of roasted corn, Maya sleepily leaned against Huyen's shoulder and murmured, "It's warm, Mom." "Yes, dear," Huyen whispered, brushing her daughter's hair. "It's warm because we made it so." And Dee, sitting beside them, thought of how true that was. How warmth, love, and new life weren't things that arrived suddenly, but things you built piece by piece, day by day, until they finally felt like home. Outside, the stars appeared, scattered and clear. Inside, 3 hearts beat quietly together, And winter, for the first time, didn't feel cold at all. Night descended softly, wrapping the little house in shades of silver and gold. Outside, the air was still, carrying the faint scent of damp soil and smoke. Inside, the fire glowed low, flickering across the wooden walls that now stood strong, warm against the chill of the season. Huyen sat near the doorway, a thin blanket draped over her shoulders. She watched as Day carefully added another log to the fire. His movements were quiet, deliberate, the kind of gentleness that comes from a man who has known both loss and gratitude. Maya slept peacefully in her corner, her small hand curled around Bibi's paw. The soft rhythm of her breathing filled the silence, like a lullaby the night itself was singing. Day sat down beside Huyen. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The silence between them was not empty anymore. It was full of everything they had built. The laughter, the work, the shared understanding that had slowly replaced pain with peace. After a while, Huyen whispered, "The garden looks different at night." Day followed her gaze. Through the open window, moonlight touched the soil. Each row, each leaf, shimmering faintly as if alive. "It's growing," he said, "even in the dark." She smiled softly. "Just like us." The fire cracked, sending a small spark into the air. Dee watched it fade and murmured, "It's strange. I used to think life ended when you lost everything. But maybe it just begins again, somewhere smaller, somewhere quieter." Huyen turned to him, her eyes warm. "New beginnings don't need noise," she said. "They just need heart." He nodded, the corners of his mouth lifting. "Then I think we found ours." For a long time, they sat there, two silhouettes against the light, the faint hum of the night weaving around them. Beyond the window, the peony swayed gently, its petals open to the moon, defying the cold. And in that moment, it didn't matter what tomorrow would bring. More rain, more work, or more uncertain days. Because tonight they had enough warmth to outlast the cold, enough love to outgrow the past, enough hope to begin again. Sometimes rebirth doesn't look like a miracle. It looks like this: a wooden house, a small family, and a garden that keeps blooming.